Hi, my name is Jennifer Dotson, and I'm the founder and program coordinator for Highland Park Poetry, as well as your host today for Poetry Today. Our guest is Laura Joyce-Hubbard. Laura Hubbard's nonfiction and poetry appear or are forthcoming in Poetry, the Iowa Review, the Sewanee Review, Ninth Letter, Pleiades, the Adroit Journal, Boulevard, River Teeth, Tupelo Quarterly, the anthology Wanting, Women Writing About Desire, and elsewhere. Recent awards include winner of the Iowa Review's 2022 Veteran Writing Award, winner of the 2023 Porch Prize in Poetry, winner of 2021 Ned Stuckey French Nonfiction Contest at Southeast Review, runner-up of the 2021 Poetry Contest at the Sewanee Review, and winner of the 2021 Individual Poem Prize in the William Faulkner's Pirates Alley Writing Competition. Oh, that's a mouthful. Okay. Her nonfiction was selected as a notable in the Best American Essays 2022. Laura served in the U.S. Air Force for 20 years and was among the first women to pilot the C-130. She is a fiction editor for Tri-Quarterly, an MFA candidate at Northwestern University, and the inaugural Highland Park Poet Laureate, where she lives with her family. She is also at work on an essay collection examining metaphors from flight through a feminist lens. We are very honored to have you as our guest today, so thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Jennifer.
We were chatting beforehand, and we mentioned you're one of the few poets that I know of who has a military background. Oftentimes people don't necessarily equate military service with poetry. But what would you like people to know about your military service?
Well, thank you for that question. I think I tend to write about what I want people to know, but it is helpful sometimes at a reading or in person to have the context that I'm writing from an Air Force background. That's a very different experience than someone in the Army, Marines, Coast Guard, Navy. So I think it's important to know the branch. And then also, like you said, that I served for 20 years, I will sometimes preface a poem by what it was influenced, if it was a deployment in South America or Bosnia. But generally, I tend to be drawn toward the page for the experiences that I'm looking to share or to make sense of myself.
Well, poetry does have is a good vehicle for processing experience of all kinds. You mentioned that you might have a poem in conjunction about this?
Yes, I think a poem I'd love to share to kind of help answer that is one that I wrote called Precession, and the title comes from physics or astronomy, and essentially it's about a body rotating on an axis at being moved by another one, and there can be torque involved. So I kind of thought about that as a metaphor for an experience I had when flying on a NATO peacekeeping mission into Bosnia. And I'll read the poem and then perhaps say a few more words if that's okay. Procession. We were peacekeepers. We were heading to war. I called for combat entry checklist. I called for helmet, chin strap, flak vest, waiting for compass, spinning, steady. I wait for gyros spinning, heading to Bosnia, black Kevlar in kick window. Kevlar blocked vestibular, the tilt of war. I remember a farmer pushing a till. Below, a farmer slipping into a hill. He looked up at us as he cleared his land. I looked at him, cinched harness, cleared to land. I flare, touchdown, reverse torque, remember. His plow and stare, a torque, ushers procession. Like a flare in reverse, we were peace keepers. So this is I should acknowledge too, this is a form that Jerica Brown invented called the duplex, and I think it lends to military service for me because it's a form built on repetition, where a line then becomes, the last line of a couplet becomes the first line of the next couplet. And there is something about repetition that for me lends to reflection. And essentially, I was briefed every day by the intelligence officers as we flew into Bosnia about where the threats were. We were often told there were going to be, there were people with missiles at the places where we would be on descent to the aircraft. And on this one particular landing, it was clear, we could see the ground perfectly. Flying in, I looked down in that spot where in my mind there would only be someone with a missile aimed at me. I saw this farmer, and he epitomized peacekeeping to me because the land was very much, it looked like rubble from above, and there he was, like starting anew, and in the very fraught time, working on creating something. And I thought that in that flash, I thought he really embodies peacekeeping. And here I am in my flak vest, and the C-130 always lands in reverse torque, we call it. And I thought that also kind of made me think of it in terms of procession, because seeing him really did move me or shift me of my rotational axis as I think about those missions in there.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's very cool. So poetry, what is your medium and why? You're a bit of a Renaissance woman, so you do other things than just poetry.
I do. I love writing poetry and nonfiction. I also do paper making and photography. And whenever I say paper making, people kind of go, huh? You can go to Staples for that. I actually brought some because I thought I might as well demo this. And it explains, too, how it goes with my poetry. So these are hand sheets of paper I've made that recently I'm working on a sky series. So I think they kind of look like a sky. And they resonate with my poetry, I think, because I'm also right now revising an essay about flying through the clouds. And writing is so sedentary that I find I really need something physical too. So paper making is very physical, and photography I did it more so when my children were younger because I could be interrupted and it wouldn't matter. It's great having older children now because young adults, because I have big swaths of time where I can get into my writing.
Yeah, cool. The physicality of paper making, is this like giant vats of?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah. Now I'm set up at home with a backyard studio.
Okay.
But I also will travel down to San Antonio, where I was a studio manager in a papermaking studio for the Southwest School of Art. When the pandemic came, my trips down there stopped, so I started to quickly assemble a papermaking studio. But it requires a wet studio with drains, so it's pretty extensive to have one in your home. So I do it, and you might be calling Rooter a lot if you're not careful.
Okay.
So it's really, it's primarily a summer art form for me, or as long as to the fall as I can take it. But I can very carefully try to do it indoors as well. But it involves big vats of pulp, and it's a sequential. So there's a lot of, there's the pulp, and there's working on crafting it while it's wet. Then there's a press. I have a hydraulic press, which gets a lot of the water out. And then a restraint dryer, because to have it flat, it needs to dry under restraint. And I have a fan that blows through it. And it takes several days to dry. So it has it's always a little bit of a surprise to see what it's going to look like. The colors can shift a little.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So what sort of, I mean, like the blue, what is that sourced from?
This blue is denim,
Oh.
but I also love working with indigo and black walnut. I actually wrote a zuhitsu about paper making with the black walnuts that I collect in my backyard. We have, like probably a lot of people do, the black walnuts. These are a nuisance when they fall, but they make a beautiful handmade
neat.
paper dye.
Very cool.
So you tend to get the pulp comes with, you know, a natural fiber. This is abaca. I work with flax. That's a little more beige. And then you can color with natural or synthetic pigments and dyes.
Very cool. I'm so glad that you thought to bring a sample of your paper making work. That's really, really cool.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk about it.
Well, now, was there a sequence into how you got into these different arts? I mean, which came first, the chicken or the egg, or the poetry and the paper making and photography and whatever?
Yeah, I would say poetry definitely came first as a child. It was the first, I can vividly remember wrestling with the emotion when I first understood mortality, and I was drawn to write a poem. And it, you know, wasn't any kind of amazing poem, but it was the act of trying to go to the page and work something out. My mother is in her 50th year of teaching college English in South Florida, so we grew up on a sailboat. We didn't have like a library. We didn't have room for books, but you know, poetry books are pretty thin, so we had those.
Okay, all right.
And they lent to, you know, memory, I think, and song.
Okay.
Grew up on a lot of music of the 60s and 70s, which is so much poetry.
Yeah.
So poetry came first. Paper making came actually when I was working at the Pentagon. One of the political appointees there that I worked with, Neil DeMesa, brought in this handmade paper one day. And I said, you can do that? You know, you can make paper? And it was fortuitous because when I ended up getting assigned in Texas, it turns out San Antonio has one of the premier paper-making studios in the country. And I learned from an amazing mentor and artist, Vic Walter, who unfortunately passed away during COVID. But I started making paper as I was flying, as a break from flying, because it was just so different from being in a plane, such a technical field, and I just loved having an area where I could just have more freedom and artistic expression. And then when my son, Liam, was born first, I was taking him to get his picture photographed so often, I realized we are going to go broke if I don't learn how to do this. So I studied under some amazing photography teachers at the Palm Beach Center, Palm Beach Photo Center, which was in Delray Beach, which happens to be where I grew up. So my parents would watch my boys while they were little, and I would learn photography. And it went well. I was a photographer for Mothering Magazine, and I did a lot of freelance work. And so I was really photographing them. They appeared in a lot of the magazines, and it really worked out well. And then I had gone to the Iowa Summer Writers Festival, but it took me like 16 years from my first Iowa Summer Writers Festival before I really got serious with writing.
Okay,
and the writing came later, last. I mean, first, but then last in the
terms
sequence.
of what you were
professionally. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So now, are you still? So you're still a candidate for your MFA? Is that in poetry or just general writing, or I don't know?
Well, at Northwestern, they have 2 MFAs. One is full-time, and I'm in the part-time one. The part-time one is set up for people who work and are taking like 1 class a quarter.
Okay.
It's very flexible. So with the Poet Laureate job, I have it on hold right now, and I can resume any quarter that I want. You can take one for a quarter stop.
Oh, that's good.
So it's good. It can take like a decade to finish a degree, but that's fine.
All right. That's good. No. So how has art making or creative writing impacted you as a person?
I think that it's brought me into a whole new community of artists who become friends, and it's brought me a lot of joy. The act of creating something, anything, whether it's a single line for a poem or a single sheet of paper, is just so enriching, and it's just made me, even when I'm wrestling with difficult topics. I mean, I write a lot about loss. I experienced a lot of loss over the course of my lifetime in the service and beyond. So it's not that I'm writing about really joyful things, but the act of putting it down, the act of sharing it and finding resonance with readers it does end up bringing a lot of joy. And the joy of remembrance and writing in honor and in memory of someone is satisfying, you know.
Well, not to go out of sequence too much, but of course your role as the Poet Laureate, you do a lot of that. I mean, and talk about being appointed Poet Laureate at just the right time, really, when our community needed it so much. I know you've read at both Memorial Day as well as July 4th, and you're going to be reading again on Veterans Day. So, oh boy. Shifting gears, let's move on to another question. What was an early experience for you where you learned that language had power?
Well, two, and I'd like to share a poem on this topic too. The first one was as a child on my mother's campus when Maya Angelou visited, and
oh my God! Okay, all right.
And I was like 6 or 7 years old, but my mother made me go out on stage to present her the flowers, which I did not want to do. I was an incredibly shy child, and I didn't really know what was going on. I don't know how much of the poetry I really heard or understood, but what I did very much understand is that everyone was gathered for her words and that they had tremendous impact. So that nugget nestled somewhere inside me. And then when I joined the military, I heard a lot of words directed at me that I had never heard before, and they made their own impact. And part of what I like to do in my poetry is use the language of the military, either through things like this one is called Collateral, where I use some of the lines from the Oath of Allegiance that we were required to do, and this one particular word that I heard that really got my attention. So if I can, I'll read this. This is called Collateral. We handed ourselves over as collateral, like priests handing over wafers. This is the body of, state your name. This is the blood of, state your name. We pledged an oath, gave our rights away with right hands raised, repeating after me. We solemnly swore, took the obligation freely. We stated our full names. Stripped of all we knew, first our hair. Look down, so we did. The red barber chair, the white cape clasped too tightly at the neck. When I looked up, they took my name, called me maggot. On wet grass, we threw our bodies down. 1, 2, louder, basics. 3, 4, you want mommy? 5, 6. First glints of sun hit the pink mountain peaks. To someone else, I thought, this morning is beautiful. Without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion. On my belly, eye level over blush earth, I inched forward like creek bed carp. Dirt kicked in my open mouth. I spat everything out. So that's based on a real experience where, part of it was basic training, but part of it I was we were low crawling through these tiny tunnels, and they had cage wire above us, and there was an extra small, a small, and a medium tunnel. And they forced this giant football player into the small tunnel, and I was behind him. And he, as we reached the exit point, they were shoveling dirt on our faces, and he naturally like freaked out and started backing up into me, and all his boots were kicking.
My God.
And it was going in my mouth.
God, that's awful.
And I have never forgotten that.
Yeah.
And it became, really symbolic for a lot of things. But the beauty of Highland Park helped me finish that poem. I was doing the walk down to the ravine beach, and I was trying to come up with how to describe that. And walking down Ravine Drive alongside the beautiful creek was a time where there were a lot of fish that were kind of not making it. They were trying to inch along, and there were a lot that had not made it. And they became kind of that last stanza for me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
No, that's a great poem,
Thank you.
and neat to hear how the community helped you. The physical, natural community helped you with that one. Oh, wow. So when readers are confronting your or experiencing your work, what is there are you hoping for them to take away or get from your work?
Well, it's interesting because I think that's really like an unknown to some extent. We never quite know how a reader's going to encounter our work. But I'm hoping that they might either, by writing of very specific things, they might feel some resonance in their own life, or maybe it'll spark a memory and they might want to write something down afterwards. And it's always a surprise to hear how that, but that's the hope, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. Okay, so now we come back to the big question, since we're very excited here at the City of Highland Park.
Yes.
And we have a Poet Laureate. Tell us about your new role as Poet Laureate.
Well, I think it's phenomenal that the city has launched the Poet Laureate program. It's very exciting. We're one of not many poet laureates in the area. Chicago now has one,
Right.
Avery Young. But so it's exciting that I'm particularly fortunate because this is the first, I'm serving in the first role, and I've had a lot of people to talk to. So speaking of veteran poets, I first talked to Karen Schofield, who was the Poet Laureate in Massachusetts, and she has a career in the Army, and her collection of poetry is Battle Dress. So we talked a lot about Poet Laureate. I've talked to the first Poet Laureate in Orlando who served during the Pulse shooting and wrote poems for that.
Okay.
And then at Northwestern, I've studied with Natasha Trethewey, who has been a phenomenal mentor, and she served as the U.S. Poet Laureate for 2 terms under Obama, and is so wildly talented and successful. And so she really brought the job down to, as she does in her poems and as she does in the classroom, she always goes back to the words and to the definitions and to looking them up. And she said, remember, it's in the job is in the words. So Poet Laureate, the first word is poet, and your job is to poet. It is to write poems. So to continue on my projects that I have been working on and to be in the act of writing as much as I can, whether they're poems I read at the city or not, but to be actively writing. And then the second is Laureate, which is to receive the honor that the city has given me based on my achievements, which is incredibly, I'm incredibly grateful to do. And then most poet laureates have a specific interest area, and they do a project. So working with the Arts Council and the city, there are many things we have cooking, but what I'm most interested in serving, as you alluded to earlier, in this time of Highland Park, in the aftermath, in a town that has experienced tragedy. What I have found most restoring is the natural setting here in our town. The lake
Love
shore.
the lake.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope to be doing some things down at the lake in the works. But this month, at the end of October, on the 28th, out at Heller Nature Center, doing a workshop on poetry and photography, walk the trails, talk about poetry, talk about photography. Because I wouldn't say, I'm not a poet who writes of joy and of restoration. I think I'm working toward that, but it is the spaces in Highland Park that I think are so restorative and are so healing. And so my hope is to combine those beautiful natural spots with poetry, with community, with gathering, and that will serve the community in some way.
Oh, definitely, definitely. That's great. We are winding down. I guess this question: did you have a hard lesson learned?
Yes, I have a poem. I'll be quick.
All right. Okay.
I had a hard lesson learned in pilot training. This is long. It's 2 pages.
Okay, we can do it.
Okay. And I'll just read it. Let me say that the audience won't know this, but there are lines woven in from Rukeyser and Sexton. And so that's just something to know in this. It's called Revisiting Icarus. And then the only thing you need to know is that student pilots in the Air Force are called studs. Studs clustered around me like crows. My solo, they claimed, was the only chance I'd have to get away with it. All men, then. They said it was like going into the world and the sky, like wondrously tunneling into that hot eye. I wanted their ease, their swagger, been waiting all day, or perhaps longer. So when I had no instructor behind me, under a glass canopy in my empty tandem, I grabbed the stick, pushed gunmetal gray throttles to max, and pulled my Talon jet like an arrow. Shocked starlings pumping past me toward the dome of Phoenix sky, twirling larger than a sail over the fog, a vertical corkscrew in the cornflower blue. I was on the edge of a new relation. The instructor's warning pulsed in my ears as I sliced summer air. Don't let the jet get in front of you. He said all the buckles were very firm, but the supersonic jet only wanted to get away from me. I pierced the top of my altitude block, acclaiming the sun, crossing into space that didn't belong to me. Suspended, I longed to return to that first flawless moment over the lawn of the labyrinth. But I didn't know how to lasso the craft, like a dart released from my hand, the altimeter a spinner wheel now. I crossed into jet routes and feared I'd come plunging down unless I dragged it back to lift. I'd spent my airspeed like a prodigal son. Just don't cry. I floated in gravity's palm, watched my hands cradle the jet, push the needle nose into a slow motion arc aimed for the Superstition Mountains. There below are the trees, pinyon, juniper, oak. I thought it would have been better than this, more thrill than spilling myself into a plushy ocean of atmosphere. My fellow stud's smug smiles met me like marshaller's chalks. Did you do it? Fire at my neck, strange little tug at my shoulder blade. My answer dripped from my mouth like hot wax. So that's based on a dare and I took it. And
Well, thank you so much for being our guest today, and viewers can see Laura Joyce-Hubbard read more poetry on Saturday, October 14th at 4 p.m. at Madame Zuzu's, 1876 First Street. Cover is a one purchase minimum, and the open mic immediately follows. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really glad to meet you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for tuning in. And I have tips for aspiring writers. You can email the Highland Park Poet Laureate address, and I'll send them to you.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.